Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Today, revisionism, those who would revise our understanding of World War II and those who would defend it. Victor Davis Hanson, military historian, professor of classics, a fellow at the Hoover Institution, I quote you, World War II was worth it. You intend to stand by that?
I think so.
You will. Christopher Hitchens, author and journalist, quote, "Is there any one shared principle or assumption on which our political consensus rests? One would probably get the widest measure of agreement for the proposition that the Second World War was a good war." You'll stand by that.
Well, I will say that it's my view as well as the consensus view.
All right. World War II was a good war.
It gashes me somewhat to put it like that.
All right. Our first revisionist here today, Pat Buchanan, in his new book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. The background, and then Buchanan's central argument. It takes a moment to set up the background, but bear with me here. September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain visits Munich to negotiate the agreement to the German annexation of the Sudetenland, which is the border region of Czechoslovakia, which is heavily populated by German speakers. In return, Chamberlain believes he's gotten Hitler to agree to give up any further territorial claims in Europe. In the following weeks, Hitler reneges. He not only annexes the Sudetenland, but moves in and occupies Prague, then places Poland under increasing pressure to give up Danzig, a free city hived out of East Prussia by the Treaty of Versailles, but Poland is in control of Danzig's external affairs. Danzig has a German population of about 95%, completely surrounded by Polish territory. March 31st, 1939, Chamberlain reverses his policy of appeasement, rising in the House of Commons to announce British support for Poland in the event of, quote, any action which clearly threatens Polish independence, close quote. August 24th, we're three items from the end. August 24th, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They agree not to invade each other. September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and September 3rd, 1939, Chamberlain announces that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany. Buchanan's central argument, quote, what made a European war inevitable was not Hitler's occupation of Prague, but Britain's guarantee to Poland. Had there been no war guarantee, Poland might have done a deal over Danzig and been spared 6 million dead Poles. Had there been no war guarantee, there would have been no British declaration of war on September 3rd, and there might have been no German invasion of France in May 1940 or ever. There was nothing inevitable about Hitler's war in the West. Victor?
Well, it's not an isolated act. Remember that what made Chamberlain...
The invasion of Poland.
No. What made Chamberlain come to his senses, it was a long line that had gone from the violations. And Buchanan makes the argument, the Versailles Treaty, he quotes this creepy Lady Astor, that Hitler was born at Versailles. But the point is...
Creepy Lady Astor is an American, Victor. No?
And she's
born
especially creepy. We should, as Americans, point that out.
Yes, her home in England was the social headquarters of the Munich set.
The appeasers.
Yes.
Cliveden, right.
But anyway, I mean, it came after the violation of the demilitarized Rhineland, the Anschluss, the fragmentation of Czechoslovakia, the murder of the former German chancellor, the murder of the Austrian. I mean, already there were the Kristallnacht and with the Jews. So all of this was sequential and serial and incremental. And finally, the Allies, especially England, realized it was they had no choice. It was essentially they were bankrupt in ideology and courage unless they finally drew the line. It was unfortunate that they were not in a position to draw the line militarily. At least Britain wasn't. Maybe France could have invaded on the west when they went into Poland. But the point that Buchanan makes in the book is always out of context. He says that Churchill considered this a disastrous move, and he quotes liberal-thinking people who thought it was a disaster, not because they finally drew the line, but because for 5 years they did not draw the line, and then they had no choices when they were at the point of war.
Christopher, when Chamberlain gives Poland a war guarantee, Britain has at its disposal 5 divisions. The Germans have 100. In the 6 months between the granting of the war guarantee and, nearly 6 months between granting the war guarantee and Hitler's invasion of Poland, Britain extends no credit to Poland. It places no advisors on the ground. It offers no concrete aid to Poland whatsoever. They shouldn't have done it because it was a bluff, and you ought not to make bluffs when you're dealing with Adolf Hitler.
there's not much to quarrel with there. I mean, it is a rather quixotic gesture, but it's rendered quixotic by the fact that it's the last stand you can make, unless you're going to follow Buchanan's invitation to tautology, which is to agree that there won't be a war as long as we give Hitler everything he wants all the time. I mean, to an extent that must be true, but to the extent that Buchanan derives this from appeasable German grievances, such as the Sudetendeutsch minority, for example, he's, I think, consciously trying to deceive us. The example I gave in my polemic against him in Newsweek was this. In 1936, Germany and Italy combined to invade Spain with some right-wing Spanish fascist mutineers to overthrow a democratically elected Republican government. Spain is not a profiteer country from Versailles. Spain doesn't. No German population. Spain doesn't have a German-speaking minority. Spain can't encircle Germany. It's on the other side of the Pyrenees. It's a pure act of calculated fascist imperialism. And my strong suspicion is that Buchanan, whose tradition is that of the Catholic fascist League, Father Coughlin in the United States, his well-known sympathy for General Franco and so forth, is concealing something from us that would be very unpleasant if further explored.
I want to return to the Polish war guarantee because Buchanan argues that absent that guarantee, things might have been much better for everyone involved, including the Poles. It seems to me that you don't need to grant Pat Buchanan's entire ethic and view of the war to think that that may actually be so. That is to say, if Britain had not granted the Polish war guarantee, kept its mouth shut, and rearmed as quickly as it could, then 18 months later or 2 years later, it may have been in a better position to face Hitler down. Yeah. No? Is there not an argument there?
If you really wants to play this speculation, there is a terrible way of doing this that keeps one awake. It comes from Sebastian Haffner's brilliant biography of Hitler. It was something that Hitler's generals noticed when it was too late. Hitler was physically and mentally decomposing. We know this now.
Right.
They suddenly began to understand that the insane orders he was giving them
were strictly
about
insane.
The war in the East,
right.
was because he knew he didn't have much time, and he had to either see Germany totally ruined, which he wouldn't have minded, or totally triumphant, which is what he would have liked, very soon, very quickly. Once you realized that Germany was being run by a psychopath, a concession, by the way, that Buchanan doesn't make. He seems to regard Hitler as a very canny and brilliant statesman, which I want to dispute with him. But once you grant that he's a decomposing, probably syphilitic, terminal syphilitic, of course it'd be very intelligent just to wait it out.
Right.
Run out the clock on him as long as you can. Deny him the chance to start a global war, because under the cover of war he can also start the Holocaust. If you really want to play this game, you can, but you can't play it as a sympathizer of Charles Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, and General Franco and the Sudetendeutsch.
Okay, but one point is that he assumes that all of these atrocities are unleashed only because of war and only because the British box Hitler in. And suddenly out of the head of Zeus comes the final solution, as if all during the 30s, whether it was the deportation of the mentally ill or racial exclusionary laws or the ostracism of Jews, that you didn't have the nucleus of what was going to become, whether you had a war or not. It was only predicated on one variable, German power. As soon as Germany had the power, then this awful vision was going to be realized, war or not war.
Let me come to that, the Holocaust, next segment here. Pat Buchanan, quote, "For what happened to the Jews of Europe, Hitler and his collaborators bear full moral responsibility. But was the Holocaust inevitable?" Close quote. Now, needless to say, I'm bastardizing, and the argument is made at length here, but very briefly, Buchanan notes that the Swansea Conference, which works out the administrative details of the final solution, doesn't take place until January 1942, that Hitler himself, and he quotes several times from the diaries of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, including February 1942, quote, "World Jewry will suffer a great catastrophe. The Fuhrer realizes the full implications of the great opportunity offered by this war," close quote. From this chronology, Buchanan writes, the destruction of the Jews was not a cause of the war, but an awful consequence of the war. With no war in the West, all the Jews of Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Greece might have survived, as did the Jews of Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland, close quote.
And where did all this idea come from? I mean, he's in a war, and suddenly he finds he's in a war, an existential war, and suddenly it comes to him that he has to start killing Jews? Or is he saying that he says he bears full responsibility throughout the book, and that but is Well, he wouldn't have really been capable of. It's like a heroin addict that really wouldn't take heroin unless somebody gave it to him, as if they can't find a way to find it any other way. I mean, there were already mechanisms all during when they start killing people at Baba Yar, or they start going in with special groups on the first day of the Russian invasion. All of those things can't be organized, contemplated, envisioned just because of a war scenario. I mean, all of these things, and the character of ritual assassination, systematic ethnic cleansing. I mean, what he had done was on a smaller, but was absolutely consistent with the Holocaust.
So you don't believe that the war unhinges them from the last vestige of morality? You don't buy that at all?
I entirely agree with what Victor says. I would intensify it a bit, underline it by saying there's a program for genocide laid out in a book called Mein Kampf that comes out in the 20s. The entire electoral program of the National Socialist Party of Germany is to say that the woes not just of their country but of the world are to be blamed on world Jewry. Their motive for invading the Soviet Union, for breaking the Hitler-Stalin Pact, in the first place is to exterminate what they call Judeo-Bolshevism. They think communism, their other great enemy, is a Jewish plot.
And we know
so it's written into the raison d'etre of Nazism is anti-Semitism, the organizing principle.
And isn't it the case, I'm remembering my history
Buchanan
now.
makes it something that's opportunist and contingent. It's a completely
What was
ahistorical.
the German plan? They were all going to be peacefully deported to where? Madagascar? And this was all going to be done under the auspices of a peaceful German empire.
Well, now, Buchanan does make the argument that passage of the Nuremberg laws, which are harshly discriminatory toward Jews, that takes place in 1935. Between that moment and Kristallnacht is 1938. Between the passage of the Nuremberg laws and the Kristallnacht, violence against the Jews, perhaps half of German Jews have left. And then after Kristallnacht and before the war, the statistics indicate another half leave. So something like, and he makes the distinction that there's a difference between, in effect, driving Jews out of your country and penning them up and sending them to the gas chambers. That's a critical distinction, right?
And where did a lot of the Jews go? They went to places like Warsaw that Hitler was planning to invade.
Right.
Absolutely.
I thought the largest numbers went west.
Not necessarily. Kristallnacht was caused by the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jew who was denied access to Warsaw and was stateless. And remember, this is a guy who had to bathe 7 times because he discovered his chief of staff had married a Jew. And so, I mean...
And during the war, during the night and fog period under the cover of which the Holocaust takes place, very often they will use scarce resources like railway trains,
right.
Important detachments, so to get on with killing Jews when these people are needed at the front. They were willing to jeopardize their war aims in order to finish with the Jewish people. This is not something that comes as a
spasm of anger. This is a high priority, coldly thought out.
You got to remember the ideology of the Buchanan argument. It accepts certain things, that Hitler is a monster and he's capable of all these horrible things, but if you and he wants to get out of his cage all the time, but you one day were not a careful zookeeper, so you left the cage slightly open and he got out, and therefore you're responsible for all the crimes he committed, as if it's...
You see, it's as if to say that Hitler was a rational actor.
Well, that's exactly that. I think is one. That's the historical calculation one has to make. That if they had not made if the British had not made the guarantee to Poland, one of the critical arguments is if the British had not offered the war guarantee to Poland, would there have been a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact? And the notion there is no, because
Actually,
Hitler would.
It's Munich that leads to the Hitler-Stalin Pact. As Trotsky points out at the time, the only person who noticed it, he said, now that Mr. Chamberlain has done this and sold the Czechs to try and preserve the British Empire with Hitler, the next thing that Hitler will do is make an agreement with Stalin. But you see, it's just as insane for the Germans knowing
that extemporaneous
it's
or
just
contemporaneous.
It's just as insane for the Germans knowing that if they invade Poland, they have a war with the British Empire. It's just as irrational and quixotic of them to do that as it is for Chamberlain to say, if you touch Poland, we really will fight you. Now, Buchanan says, Hitler was so upset by Britain's failure to take his deal. We have Europe, you have India.
Right.
That he invades Russia to impress them. Now, this is the action of an insane.
And remember what he said
Nazi
when he went
dictatorship.
into already well before 1941. He stated again and again to his generals, maybe we can handle Britain and maybe we can handle Russia, but we cannot handle the United States. This is a country that put 250,000 people every 2 months in World War I,
right.
and finally had up to 3.5 million people by 1919 on the European continent. Hitler had known that, so he understood that eventually if he was going to go down that path, it was inevitable that it wasn't just that Britain was impotent when he went into Poland, but it was a whole mechanism that going into Poland was the last straw for all liberal-thinking people in democracies. And so this idea that Churchill and Roosevelt cooked up this war was crazy.
Well, hold on. Buchanan, Hitler and the Jews, one last time. Buchanan, grant everything you said. That still leaves the question, was it correct for the Allies to push for unconditional surrender? Did the war aims go too far? Buchanan, quote, at Casablanca in 1943, Churchill and FDR declared their war aim was, quote, unconditional surrender. At Quebec in 1944, Churchill and FDR approved the Morgenthau Plan, calling for the destruction of all German industry. Goebbels used the Morgenthau Plan to convince Germans that surrender meant no survival, and here's the critical sentence, annihilation of their hostages, the Jews, was the price the Nazis extracted for their own annihilation. Close quote. Give the Germans terms earlier, and you might have saved some large number of Jews. Plausible? Madness?
It's the argument also that's made for hoping or working for the success of the Stauffenberg plan, for the German General Staff to take out Hitler and negotiate a separate peace with the West. Some people say that would have been better too.
We do hope. We do wish that Damon Stauffenberg had actually succeeded, right?
I guess we do.
All right.
But there's one. But I'd have to add the same caveat, which is this, which I get from a number of my German comrades and Austrian comrades. They wanted to be sure that Nazism was absolutely extirpated, that there was no possibility there would be another Dolchschloss theory that Germany had been stabbed in the back or betrayed from within, and that if only it had hung on, so the Germans wouldn't be doing this kind of revisionism anymore. That it would be an utter defeat, something unarguable, something finis Germaniae. Horrible.
All right. Churchill. Next segment. Churchill. Again, a word of background. With the war spreading in May 1940, political support for the Chamberlain government collapses. Churchill becomes prime minister. In that month of May 1940, it's clear Germany is making diplomatic overtures. Halifax in the cabinet is probing Churchill over a critical period of several days. Will you accept a deal? They let us keep the empire. We stay out of the general war. There's some evidence in people that Churchill seems to have considered it for about 48 hours. There's no deep consideration, but he doesn't rule it out immediately. But the final decision is no. He rejects the overtures and insists on pursuing the war, prosecuting the war. Now here,
remember, the mediator proposed was Mussolini. They'd have had to.
Was that where Ciano come in?
They'd have had to go. Ciano. They'd have had to accept the mediation of Mussolini.
All right.
There's quite a lot to be asked to swallow.
Right. Now, I have to say, when I'm reading this, strikes me as a reach, but not implausible, not altogether implausible. Buchanan argues that Hitler is convinced Churchill wants to prosecute the war because Churchill has the lingering hope that he'll be able to turn the Soviet Union, that Britain and Russia will be able to ally themselves and force Germany into a two-front war. So Hitler decides, things went pretty well in France. France falls in 6 weeks. He decides on a lightning strike in Russia to knock Russia out. But all the time, he's doing it with an eye on Churchill and trying to impress Britain. And there are quotations here. He quotes again their generals writing in their diaries that the main enemy is Britain. We're moving into Russia because of Britain. Quoting Buchanan, by his refusal even to consider a negotiated peace, Churchill caused Hitler to commit his fatal blunder, invading Russia. This would bring the downfall of Hitler, but add 4 more years to the war and bring death to tens of millions. Was it worth it? Churchill should have settled.
No, remember, this is the same author who argues that had Britain just stayed out of things and had continued the policy of appeasement, then Hitler and Stalin would have inevitably clashed, and they would have had this war.
The Nazis and the Soviet communists would have worn each other out,
and the democracies would have sat out and watched these two atrocious systems wipe each other out. And it would be probably a little bit better because he thinks Russia would have probably lost, and European Christianity and the white race and all this would have won. And then, after that's the subtext of most of the book. And then after saying that, he says that Britain caused this war in the East eventually by giving this guarantee to Poland. And what keeps it completely out of the argument is, of course, while all this is going on, there's unrestricted submarine warfare that is destroying American ships, which he knows, and he's getting this pressure from his naval commanders. Remember, he declared war on the United States. We didn't declare war on him because he wanted to destroy Britain economically, and the only way he could do that was to destroy the convoys from the United States. So the idea that he wasn't doing things that were precipitous, dangerous, and would inevitably lead to war is crazy.
Churchill. You, by the way, let the record show that you've been quite critical of the Churchill myth, the Churchill legend.
I have, and of the overuse to the point of diminishing returns of the Munich analogy for everything.
Right, exactly.
Though, by the way, I think this might be a point at which to say that the other hidden agenda Buchanan has, apart from to whitewash Catholic fascism and collusion with it, is to oppose the war in Iraq.
Right. Actually, we'll come to that, but go ahead.
All right. Well, I just thought I'd put down that marker in case you...
That's fair. That's fair. He's explicit about that. He's explicit about that.
Churchill, remember, had been very pro-Mussolini in the early days of Italian fascism. He had written in his book, Great Contemporaries, a very flattering portrayal of Adolf Hitler, saying he hoped that if Britain was ever to suffer similar extremity as Germany had, that they would find a saviour of the same time. So not a guy who was very hard to persuade when it came to hardline, anti-communist, right-wing forces. But for that reason, very impressive when he suddenly realizes, this is not that. This isn't what I thought it was. This is something pornographic and insane. And really menacing, and there isn't any possibility of coexistence with it. We can't, he said, we can't breathe the same air as these people. They have to go. He would have loved to manipulate a war between Germany and Bolshevism. I mean, it would have been Churchill's idea initially to invade the Soviet Union.
Right, exactly.
That's exactly 1919. Not just an idea, it was carried into execution with American forces as well as British ones.
In his defense also, we forget that this, while Buchanan is quite accurate in pointing out the paltry resources of Britain in September of 1939, what he doesn't realize is that Hitler, it is true that Churchill is asking two things. He wants to rearm, and he wants to, by 1939, stop the appeasement. Right. But after the fall of France, when Churchill takes the reins of government, he didn't have a lot of options. This is a man who was making an argument, finally, and Christopher's right about his sordid statements in the middle 30s, but finally he was making a stand with very few resources. And he was making it speaks well of him that he was trying to rally the best in the British people to stop a nightmarish ideology of which he didn't have a lot of resources at his disposal.
Grant everything you've said about Churchill and the importance to all of world history of that moral insight. Did he prosecute the war wisely? Was he good on strategy and tactics? I mean, there are plenty of American military historians who would say, we could have moved into Normandy a year earlier if Churchill hadn't insisted on that ridiculous approach from Italy, that it was Churchill. He got all kinds of things wrong. He got the moral insight right.
Michael Howe's just written a very interesting critique of the Italian campaign, for example. And every account you read of the Norwegian campaign is absolutely calamitous. Well, the accounts are calamitous. The campaign was calamitous.
Yes, right.
No, that's true. It's just that, and the accusation made regularly by Goebbels on Nazi radio that Churchill enjoyed war and was half drunk all the time, literally drunk, because he really loved doing it with a big glass of brandy and a cigar and had a thorough relish for the business. Absolutely true.
This is true.
All true, and just as well. Just as well.
But there's no way, I think most military historians would agree on this. There was no way the United States was capable of invading Western Europe, Normandy or wherever, Cherbourg, wherever.
Normandy took place as soon as it could have done?
Absolutely.
Oh, you're okay.
Yeah, the Dieppe raid, it showed that the United States was not in a position, whether it's landing craft or tactics, and even after we forget, 3,500 killed landing on Normandy may have been an impressive achievement. That the cost, but then we lost 80,000 people in the next 6 weeks in the hedgerow. So it was not it was a near-run thing even in 1944 in June.
Okay. Buchanan's second charge against against Churchill, that he focused so monomaniacally on Hitler that he underestimates or he loses sight of the threat from Stalin. I quote Buchanan, "The destruction of Germany to which Churchill had dedicated himself." This is following on the point that Churchill refused to deal, refused to offer them terms. He presses for unconditional surrender. "The destruction of Germany to which Churchill had dedicated himself left a power vacuum that Stalin inevitably filled. Britain fought Nazi tyranny only to pave the path to power for a greater tyranny." Close quote.
It's the first thing I ever wrote about Churchill, actually with the help of someone Victor doesn't like, A.J.P. Taylor. many years ago when those papers were opened in 1974. The Premier
State
papers.
papers.
Yeah.
Churchill's
Premier papers, as they're
Right.
called. The deal he made with Stalin in Moscow in 1944, literally on the back of an envelope, giving Stalin 90% of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, in exchange for Britain retaining the predominant interest in Greece and Turkey. And when you consider that it was Poland that Britain had gone to war for in the first place, it's a pretty sordid and shabby deal. And there's, I think, no arguing with that. Buchanan, though, I think, is short-termist about this. He says that Stalin and Stalinism, communism was the greatest profiteer of the Second World War. That's only true for a couple of decades, really. I mean, we can now see that the war that started really in 1914, that goes on
the century
with various truces, armed truces and so on, doesn't really end till the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989.
Yeah.
Right.
But by that stage, totalitarian ideology has not just been defeated in modern society, it's been discredited thoroughly, and without a thoroughgoing stand to root out Nazism in the first place, I don't think that could have happened.
We depart from Pat Buchanan for a moment here. Neil Ferguson has a book and a PBS television series of the same name, The War of the World. Ferguson stresses, here's the list here, American soldiers, this is based on the first installment of the series, American soldiers sometimes executed prisoners, as surely as did the Germans and especially the Japanese. The destruction by the Allies of Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki resembles a lot the terror bombing that the Germans inflict on London and other cities. Churchill and FDR hail Joseph Stalin as an irreplaceable ally. Joseph Stalin is, of course, a mass murderer. Now, listen to two quotations. Neil Ferguson, quote, "The Allies adopted the most brutal tactics of those they were fighting," close quote. Rush Limbaugh, I direct this one to you in particular, Christopher, quote, "Now we've got this revisionist historian trying to say we're no better than the people we beat because we were using the same totalitarian tactics. This is a latest example of the attempt to convince as many Americans as possible that the United States is no better than any of the worst despots and mass murderers that have ever lived. Thank you, PBS." Close quote. So who are you with on that one, Christopher? Rush Limbaugh or Neil Ferguson?
Mr. Limbaugh was very flattering about my good self in the New York Times last Sunday. So I
Yes,
suppose
he was, actually.
I
That's
suppose
right.
I owe him
That's
one.
right.
Actually, he somehow, try as he may, he could never find my G-spot. I don't understand why people admire him. I just
Oh, you don't?
get, no.
Oh, well,
I can't,
we'll have a drink
just
on that
can't
one
get it.
because
But anyway, if I haven't had the advantage of reading Mr. Ferguson's book, I'm an admirer of his work in general. The difference, I suppose, would be this. Germany and Japan in defeat were very expensively and carefully nourished back to life and health and democracy and prosperity. I don't think that would have been the case for a German-occupied Russia or German-occupied United Kingdom. And I think I'd rest my case on that distinction.
And we know what happened in
And
the
it's-
Japanese
and it's-
occupied
and it's
Manchuria.
important. Yes.
Right.
The difference is that in all war, there's a process of brutality, and it becomes worse and worse. Every party to a war, no matter whether a liberal democratic government or an autocracy, will find themselves caught in that spiral, in that descent into barbarity. But the difference between the Allies and Germany and Japan was twofold. Number one, atrocity was incidental. It was not essential to their war making. In the sense that you didn't have special groups of British soldiers who went out and found Jews and slaughtered them, or you didn't have anything like the rape of Nanking, or you didn't have 10 to 15,000 Asians per week being killed in the last years of World War II by Americans and British in China and Korea and Formosa. That's one thing. And the other is magnitude.
No attempt to make their own civilians commit mass suicide in the face of defeat.
And
there wouldn't have been.
The other argument is more of a subtle one, and it involves magnitude, which I think Neil Ferguson didn't point out clearly enough, and that is that while there was this difference in the way that, and first of all, Hiroshima was really in reaction to the savagery of the island hopping campaign.
Right.
And people, remember, after Okinawa was declared secure and they looked back and saw 50,000 casualties, the popular American outcry at the end of the war just 90 days later was not, we dropped the bomb. But surely you must have, if you exploded it in mid-July, you must have known it was there and you could have avoided Okinawa.
Right.
So the point that I'm making is its
You're
magnitude.
speaking to the son of a man who was on a ship just off Okinawa and watching kamikaze pilots.
My grandfather, my namesake, was killed there. So the point that I'm making is that the fact that in retaliation, to stop atrocity, that the Allies engaged in types of activities that killed a lot of people doesn't make it the moral equivalent of people who would have done far worse, only they didn't have the access to the technology or the material resources.
There is some very unpleasant stuff, though. If you read the conversations of Charwell and Lindemann and the advisors to Churchill on area bombing, they say, we recommend that you bomb the working class areas of Hamburg because the houses are closer together, the people are packed more tightly, you'll get more deaths per bomb. And remember, these are the areas of Germany that had never voted for Hitler. Hitler, I think, I'm right in saying, that barely even visited Hamburg, even when he was Chancellor, because he knew he was hated there. It was a socialist working class city. It's horrible to think, when we ask our rather smug question, what happened to all the good Germans during the terrible period of Nazism? Well, a lot of them were being killed by the RAF.
Nagasaki, by the way, was the center of Catholicism in Japan.
Yes.
Took out the one place where there are actually a large concentration of Christians in Japan. However, we have ratified this. There is a fundamental moral distinction to be observed, and to miss it is obtuse. That is to say, all three of us agreed that Mr. Rush Limbaugh is correct.
Yes, I think
This time, I have to say so, yes.
And
Actually, it's rather,
got it.
it's phrased in a rather spirited way, too.
Well, that you can count on him for.
Ask yourself that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Imagine a Japanese victory and a German victory in 1945, and ask what Europe and Asia would look like today vis-a-vis what they do look like today, and why is there a probable difference?
Let me take Neil Ferguson's second point that Ferguson makes. The principal beneficiary of the Second World War, quote, was Stalin's Soviet Union. The wartime alliance with Stalin, for all its inevitability and strategic rationality, he grants that, was nevertheless an authentically Faustian pact. Get ready for this sentence. The victory of 1945 was a tainted victory, if indeed it was a victory at all. Close quote. What do you do with that?
Well, we've discussed that already, that in the short term, you can make the argument that in a geopolitical sense, Russia was empowered. In the long term, you can see World War II as part of an integral process that led to not only the destruction of Japanese militarism, fascism, Nazism, but also the discrediting of the Soviet Union and the world that we see today that's free of both communism and Nazism. So I think that's important to point out.
The victory is not tainted.
No,
it is a victory and it's not tainted.
But I don't understand
No,
this.
because I don't disagree with Victor necessarily, but the argument that you can put against Buchanan or Ferguson,
right,
is that there's always the option, and it did exist, it was real, of standing up to fascism a lot earlier than we did. A lot of the catastrophic consequences are the result of postponing the resistance until 1940, instead of drawing a line either with or without the League of Nations and appealing for American help in no later, I would say, than 1936 in Spain, or maybe better, opposing Italian genocide and aggression in what was then called Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. Now, all these chances are missed, but because of the beast.
What is the year in
because
which Haile Selassie gives that moving speech to the League of Nations? What year was that?
Gosh, I really ought to know. I think it's 1934.
34. So that's during the Spanish Civil War. So it's the early 30s.
Yes.
First half of the 30s.
Yeah.
Is your argument?
And because the beast is insatiable, it doesn't recognize any of these things as concessions. It just thinks of them as signs of weakness.
There's two other things that I remember. I don't see quite the argument that the Soviet Union comes off so well. This is a country that lost 20 million dead in World War II and is very weakened severely. And a lot of the problems it shows in the 50s and 60s and 70s and the Cold War was a direct result of the damage that was inflicted in World War II. So it's not, and I know that was by Germany, but nevertheless the idea that it just was Machiavellian and figured out this war, how to be on the right side and how to use the Allies, and it comes out in 1945 when this wonderful, there were millions of Russians who didn't believe in communism. They were good, wonderful people that went out and fought the Wehrmacht and saved Mother Russia, not the Soviet Union. That's not what they were fighting for. The second thing is this notion of post facto utopianism, in which we sit here in the most wealthy, affluent age of civilization, and we go back to our ancestors who really, in a direct lineal process, gave us everything that we have. And we say, you know what? They weren't perfect, and therefore they weren't good.
Pat Buchanan, his book, The Unnecessary War and the War in Iraq. This is from Pat Buchanan's introduction, in which he's discussing the reasons for writing the book. Quote, there's a longish quotation, but I'll put it on the table and let you have it. There has arisen among America's elite a Churchill cult. After 9/11, the Churchill cult helped to persuade an untutored president that the liberation of Iraq from Saddam would be like the liberation of Europe from Hitler. Democracy would put down roots in the Middle East as it had in Europe after the fall of Hitler, and George W. Bush would enter history as the Churchill of his generation. This Churchill cult gave us our present calamity. If not exposed, it will produce more wars and more disasters. Close quote. Christopher?
Yeah, well, there used to be a slogan in the 1930s, a slogan of the left and the Popular Front, actually. It said, fascism means war. And a good slogan, I think, because it meant both that fascism intends war, desires it, but also it necessarily involves it. Mm. It means it. It is equivalent to it. You can't have one without the other. In other words, you can't have peace with it. I think the same can be said of the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, which modeled itself partly on Stalin and partly on Hitler. Had Ba'athist ideology helped itself to both of these, and was ceaselessly engaged in aggression against its neighbors as well as genocide against its own inhabitants. So there was no compromise possible. There was no containment. All the horrors of this last war result again from having put off the confrontation with Saddam for far too long, allowed him to be in power enough times to invade three neighbors and to attack three neighbors rather, and to stay in power for the best part of a quarter of a century.
I would add that.
So it's actually quite a good analogy, and we owe it to Buchanan for underlining it.
The two reference, or maybe the two catalysts.
The central moral insight is the same. This is someone with whom we cannot abide. Saddam Hussein and all right.
When you read the end of Buchanan's book and you start to see that there's a contemporary catalyst, encouragement for this type of revisionist thinking of World War II, what made him write this book? It seems pretty apparent when you read it that it was the events post not just 2001, but say 1996 and all. And because prominently is the Serbian situation where in Buchanan's worldview, went in and bombed a Christian white nation in the heart of Europe, for whom Muslims support apparently. But when you look at his two examples of what we did wrong and how we had to learn from World War II, they're very shaky, because where are we now?
You mean Serbia being one and
Absolutely.
Iraq being
We
the
stopped
other?
the genocide in the middle of the Balkans that killed over 200,000 people or wounded them or exiled them, and a monster named Milosevic is gone, and there's the seeds, at least, of consensual governments in that area where there were nothing but really a rogue, fascist, communist, whatever you want to call Milosevic and his clique. And then we had Saddam Hussein.
National Socialist, yes, would be a good description of it.
And then we have Saddam Hussein, and just this week the Maliki government is discussing with us whether we should leave their country, and we will. Right. So there's a constitutional government in the heart of the ancient caliphate, which was absolutely preposterous to even think that. And then we're supposed to believe that what we see today in Iraq with the Petraeus surge and the constitutional government, and what we see in the Balkans is a complete folly, because we didn't learn that we should have let Hitler alone in World War II, and the alternative of having Milosevic and Saddam Hussein would be much better for the world and for us. Okay. It's preposterous.
We close out the program. Claire Luce used to say that history would give even the greatest men only a single sentence apiece. Lincoln freed the slaves. Let me give you a couple of names and ask you for one sentence in return. Christopher, Adolf Hitler.
Well, the greatest enemy of the German people.
Victor.
He's the worst nightmare within the human species.
Joseph Stalin.
Firm but fair. No, just kidding. No. Just kidding. Joseph Stalin, the gravedigger of communism.
Really?
Yes, the gravedigger of communism.
Victor? That's a separate show. We'll have to sit you down one more time.
The co-greatest evil of the human experience and nature.
Right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
First-class temperament.
All right.
For all his weaknesses and human pathologies, which he displayed in numerous things, he was on score, the right person at the right time in World War II.
In the Second World War.
Absolutely.
And Winston Churchill.
A lover of war and wine and brandy, and genial in victory and unbowed in defeat.
Victor?
He usually did the good thing last, after he thought and wrote and said all of the other bad things first.
He did the right thing last. I like that.
That's
No,
just-
neither of you is
it's
going to
interesting.
call him the
That's-
greatest
that's
man of the
interesting.
20th century.
That's very clever, Victor, because that's what Churchill says about the Americans. They always do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
All right, all right. Victor Davis Hanson, Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
I'm Peter Robinson at the Hoover Institution for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.